as Israel is concerned, this is probably the most important event. So let us get started. Maccabean Revolt was a Jewish revolt against the Greek Assyrians. It was led by a priest named Mattathias, who actually fought in the revolt and died after a couple of years. So he's really the instigator of the revolt, and we'll talk about that, what happened, how he instigated that revolt in a moment. But he had 5 sons, and these sons were pretty influential in the history of Israel. The most famous is Judas Maccabees, who was the head of the rebel troops after his father died. And Judas Maccabees is probably the greatest military leader of the Jews in the last 2,000 years, with the possible exception of Ariel Sharon. So he's a pretty important guy. He had a brother named Jonathan, who also fought in the war. He also served as high priest and ethnarch, or governor, after Israel gained its independence. Simon also served as a rebel leader, also was the high priest. And John and Eliezer also fought. Simon had 2 sons, one also named Judas, and the other named John Hyrcanus. And John Hyrcanus' son, we talked about the civil war between the Pharisees and the Sadducees that happened in the 1st century BC. It would be his son who would be involved in that civil war. So this is kind of the scorecard before the game begins, so you know who some of the players are. So what's the Maccabean Revolt all about? One of the defining moments in Jewish history. One of the high points of the revolt is the rededication and reconsecration of the temple that had been defiled by the Assyrian Greeks. And it's commemorated today by the Jewish festival of Hanukkah, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So at the time of the revolt, Palestine, Israel, is under the control of a Seleucid king, a Syrian king, called Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And when we talk about the Syrians, in this case, we're not talking about the guys with the cone heads that took over the northern kingdom in the 700s BC. These are descendants of Alexander the Great. So when Alexander the Great took over the east, part of what he took over was the Holy Lands, northern Africa, etc. And after he died, it was carved up among his generals. So these are descendants of those generals. The Seleucids got Syria, the Ptolemies got Egypt. We've already talked about the Ptolemies because it was King Ptolemy who ordered the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. So he's a pretty important guy. And at that time, Israel was under the control of the Ptolemies, but in time they passed into control of the Seleucids, or the Greeks, in Syria, and that's where we pick up the story here. Antiochus, at the time that this happened, was very hard up for money, and he was determined to Hellenize the areas controlled by him. When we talk about Hellenizing an area, it means to make them more Greek, to have them accept Greek customs, certainly, but even Greek religion. So you can see how that would immediately put him on a collision course with the elders of Israel. Antiochus Epiphanes is possibly the abomination that causes desolation in Daniel. It's mentioned twice in Daniel. Some people also associate that with the Antichrist. The reason it's very interesting is because Christ himself mentions the abomination that causes desolation in what we call the mini-apocalypse that's in the 3 synoptic gospels. And he talks about the abomination that causes desolation, it desecrates the temple. So it sure sounds a lot like our pal Antiochus Epiphanes IV. So his coming may have been foretold in Daniel and recounted in the 3 gospels. So why does Antiochus need money? Certainly at the time of Alexander the Great, Greece is the most powerful nation or nation-state in the world. But by the time we get to 2nd century BC, that's not so clear anymore, because there's a new kid on the block that's starting to cause some problems around the Mediterranean, and that's the Romans. So there's a cataclysmic battle between the Romans and Antiochus' forces, and Antiochus' forces lose to the Romans. And the Romans tell them, you have two choices. We can either slaughter all of you, or you can pay us lots and lots and lots of money for a long time. So Antiochus thought about it, and he decided on the lots and lots of money rather than the slaughter. And so that's why he needed money at the time. So in the 173 to 171 BC time period, Antiochus puts the Jerusalem high priest position up to the highest bidder. Now, if you're going to do something that's really going to tick off the elders of Israel, this is a good thing to do. For many, many years, well, let's start with who started the priesthood. When did the priesthood start in Israel?
The Levites.
And who was the first priest? Aaron. So Moses and Aaron and Miriam are all part of the Levites, and Aaron becomes the first priest. So this is a tradition that passes down for thousands of years. Now, and eventually when Solomon builds the great temple, he actually establishes a high priest of the temple position. So that's really what we're talking about here. So for thousands of years, the high priest or the chief priest of Israel is always from the Levitical priesthood. By the time of the diaspora, when Nebuchadnezzar takes over the southern kingdom and the Assyrians with the cone heads 150 years before took over the northern kingdom, well, that becomes scattered a bit, but it's starting to recover as we get into the 2nd century BC. And here you have Antiochus Epiphanes coming along and saying, well, you want to be high priest, just pay me a lot of money and I'll make you high priest. So high priest Jason and Menelaus both achieved their positions through bribes to the Seleucid king. And he puts the first one in place because of a bribe, and then the second one pays even more money a couple years later, and he is made high priest. So already the people of Israel are kind of ticked off that their leaders, their religious leaders, I mean, they could adapt to the idea that their political leaders maybe are from an occupying force, but their religious leaders is another thing. So the people of Israel are already unhappy with Antiochus Epiphanes and so forth. In 169 BC, Antiochus still needs more money. He looks to the Jerusalem temple and says, wow, they got all kinds of gold, menorahs and stuff in there, and there's jewels and all this stuff, and I think I'll just loot it, and then I can pay off the Romans. That seems like a reasonable thing to do, so he does so.
It'd be like the Italians paying off the national debt by
looting the Vatican. A good analogy. This act follows in the footsteps of his predecessor, Seleucus IV, who had done the same thing. I often tend to tie these two events together just because it's easier conceptually. But actually the looting of the temple and the desecration of the temple, there was a 2-year gap, but they were both caused by Antiochus Epiphanes. So in 167 BC, Antiochus intensifies his attempt at Hellenization, making the Jews more like the Greeks, by desecrating the temple in Jerusalem. So here, they don't just loot it. I mean, they actually desecrate it. They do everything sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. They also built altars in the surrounding towns of Judah and offered incense at the doors of the houses and in the streets. The books of the law that they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. So, any ancient copies of the Pentateuch, for example, they just destroyed, they burned them. Anyone found possessing the Book of the Covenant or anyone who adhered to the law was condemned to death by decree of the king. They kept using violence against Israel, against those who were found month after month in the towns. On the 25th day of the month, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of burnt offering. According to the decree, they put to death the women who had their children circumcised and their families and those who circumcised them, and they hung the infants from their mother's neck. So this is a description of how the temple was desecrated.